My name is Ethan, and this is the most painful and surprising story of my life. It all started a month ago when I received the phone call that would change everything forever. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my small studio apartment in downtown Austin going through overdue bills when my phone rang. On the other end, an unfamiliar voice informed me that my grandfather Walter had passed away. My grandfather, the man who practically raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was just 8 years old. "Is there anyone else we should contact?" asked the woman from the hospital. I remained silent. The truth was, there was no one else. My grandfather and I were all that was left of our family. Well, technically, I had uncles and cousins, but I hadn't spoken to any of them in years. You see, my grandfather Walter was always considered the oddball of the family. He was a simple man who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of a small Texas town, worked as a carpenter, and had this habit of helping everyone without expecting anything in return. My uncle saw him as the poor relative of the family, always criticizing him for not taking advantage of opportunities, or for wasting his life doing manual labor. When my parents died, my uncles fought over who would take me in, but not out of love. It was about the inheritance my parents had left behind. In the end, my grandfather showed up at that horrible family meeting and simply said, "The boy's coming with me." And that's how I ended up living in that humble little house, but one filled with true love. For the next 10 years, my grandfather was my father, my mother, my teacher, and my best friend. He taught me to work with my hands, to be honest, to help others, and above all, he taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by what they have in the bank, but by what they carry in their heart. But the family never saw it that way. To them, I was the poor carpenter's grandson, and my grandfather was the old man who was ruining me with his outdated ideas. Gradually, the visits became less frequent until they simply stopped coming. Invitations to birthdays, weddings, and family gatherings ceased. It was as if we had ceased to exist for them. When I turned 18, I decided to move to Austin to study. My grandfather sold some of his most precious tools to pay for my first semesters at community college. "Son," he would tell me, "you're going to be somebody great in life, but never forget where you come from or who truly loves you." The years passed, and although I talked to him on the phone every week, visits became less frequent. Work, college, responsibilities. There was always an excuse to postpone the trip back home. My grandfather never complained, always ending our conversations by saying, "I love you, son, and I'm proud of you." The last time I saw him was 8 months ago, on his 75th birthday. I arrived with a small cake and a bottle of bourbon we shared. We spent the afternoon looking at old photos and reminiscing. That night, as I was getting ready to return to Austin, he hugged me tighter than usual and said something I didn't understand at the time. "Ethan, soon things are going to happen that you won't understand, but I want you to know that everything I did was out of love for you and love for this family that hurt us so much." Now, standing in front of my grandfather's casket in that nearly empty funeral home, those words echoed in my mind like a painful echo. The wake had started 2 hours ago, and I was still the only person present. Not a single uncle, not a cousin, not even a neighbor had shown up. The funeral director looked at me with pity. "Are you sure we published the obituary in the right places?" he asked delicately. I nodded, though inside my heart was breaking. My grandfather, the most generous man I had ever known, was leaving this world with the same loneliness he had lived with in his final years. I sat in the front row of empty chairs, took my grandfather's cold hand, and began talking to him, as if he could hear me. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry I didn't visit more often. I'm so sorry you have to leave like this, alone. But I want you to know that you're the most important man in my life, and everything good in me is because of you." Tears fell uncontrollably down my cheeks. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just saying goodbye to my grandfather, but also facing the reality that I was now completely alone in the world. I had no family, no one who really knew me or cared about me. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and cold, as if even the sky was in mourning for my grandfather. I got up early in the small motel where I had stayed, put on the only black suit I owned, and headed to the cemetery with my heart in pieces. When I arrived, The hearse was already waiting. The driver, an older gentleman with a kind face, greeted me respectfully and asked if we would wait for more family members. "No," I replied with a broken voice. "It'll just be him and me." I saw how the man looked at me with a mixture of surprise and compassion that hurt more than any words. The drive to the cemetery was silent. I drove my old Honda following the hearse, and I couldn't stop thinking about all the times my grandfather had told me, "Son, when I leave this world, I don't want tears. I want you to remember all the laughter we shared." But it was impossible not to cry, not just because of his departure, but because of the injustice that such a good man was leaving without anyone else noticing. We arrived at the cemetery and the moment became even more surreal. It was me, the hearse driver, 2 cemetery employees, and Pastor Williams, a young minister who had agreed to officiate the ceremony, almost as a personal favor. 5 people to say goodbye to a man who had touched so many lives in a positive way. As we carried the casket toward the grave, I remembered all the stories my grandfather had told me about funerals in the old days, when the entire community would gather to say goodbye to their dead, when the streets would fill with people coming to pay their last respects. "The dead don't really leave," he used to tell me. "They only leave when the last person who remembers them also leaves." In that moment, I realized I was the only living memory of Walter Thompson, and that responsibility weighed on me like a mountain on my shoulders. Pastor Williams began the ceremony with beautiful words about eternal life and the soul's rest, but I could barely concentrate. I constantly looked toward the cemetery entrance, with the secret hope that someone, anyone who had known my grandfather, would appear at the last moment. But the minutes passed, and we remained the same 5 people. "Would you like to say a few words about your grandfather?" Pastor Williams asked me gently. I approached the casket, put my hand on the polished wood, and began to speak, though my voice trembled so much I could barely pronounce the words. "My grandfather Walter was the best man I ever knew in my life," I began. "He didn't have money, he didn't have college degrees, he didn't have a big house or a fancy car, but he had something very few people have, a giant heart. He was the type of person who would get up at 5 in the morning to go fix the grocery store owner's door for free, or who would spend his last dollar buying medicine for the neighbor's sick child." The words came out choppy, between sobs I could no longer control. My grandfather taught me that being rich doesn't mean having a lot of money, but having a lot of love to give. He taught me that real family isn't the one that shares your blood, but the one that shares your heart. And although only a few of us are here today to say goodbye to him, I know that wherever he is, he's proud to have taught me to be a good man. I finished my small speech and stood there, feeling like there was a huge hole in my chest. The cemetery employees began lowering the casket, and I threw the first handful of dirt, as tradition dictates. The sound of dirt hitting the wood resonated in the cemetery's silence like a definitive echo. When everything was over, Pastor Williams approached me and put his hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather was a blessed man," he told me. "Maybe he didn't have a crowd at his funeral, but he had something better. He had you, someone who truly loved him. That's worth more than 1,000 people who come just out of obligation." The others left, and I stayed alone by the freshly covered grave. I had brought a bunch of wildflowers, the kind my grandfather liked to plant in his small garden, and I placed them on the damp earth. "Grandpa," I said quietly, "I don't know how I'm going to go on without you. I don't know how I'm going to be half the man you were, but I promise I'll try every day of my life." I sat on the ground, not caring that I was getting my suit dirty, and stayed there for hours. I told him about my work, my plans, my fears. I asked forgiveness for not visiting more often, for letting myself get consumed by city routine and forgetting what really mattered. The sun was beginning to set when I finally decided to leave. I got up, brushed the dirt off my suit, and gave one last kiss to the temporary headstone they had placed. "Rest in peace, Grandpa. Thank you for everything." I walked to my car with eyes swollen from crying and an empty heart. In that moment, I thought that was the complete story. A good man who left the world in silence, remembered only by his grandson. I thought my grandfather, Walter Thompson, had gone forever, taking with him all his secrets, all his kindness, and all his humility. But I was completely wrong. What happened the next day changed not only my perspective on my grandfather, but my entire life. Because it turns out that my grandfather, the humble carpenter who lived in a modest house, kept secrets that neither I nor anyone in the family could have imagined. And those secrets were about to come to light in the most unexpected way possible. The day after the funeral, I woke up in that motel room with a strange feeling in my chest. It wasn't just sadness, it was something deeper, an emptiness that seemed to have permanently settled in my soul. I stayed in bed until almost noon, not wanting to get up, not wanting to face a world where my grandfather no longer existed. I finally forced myself out of bed and decided to go to my grandfather's house to begin the painful process of going through his belongings. I knew I had to do it, but the idea of entering that little house full of memories without him there terrified me. The house was exactly as my grandfather had left it. His morning coffee cup was still in the sink, his newspaper folded on the dining room table, his tools perfectly organized in the small workshop he had built in the backyard. It was as if he had stepped out for a moment and would return at any instant. I sat in his favorite chair, that wooden rocking chair he had made himself years ago, and tried to process everything that had happened. The loneliness of the funeral still hurt, like an open wound. I couldn't understand how such a generous person, so beloved by everyone who knew him, had ended his days so forgotten by his own family. I was lost in these thoughts when I heard the sound of several cars stopping in front of the house. At first I thought maybe they were neighbors coming to offer belated condolences, but when I looked out the window, what I saw left me completely confused. There were 3 black SUVs with tinted windows, the kind used by important companies or the government. From the first SUV stepped an elegant man, dressed in an expensive suit, accompanied by a woman carrying a thick folder. From the other SUVs, more people got out, all dressed formally, and what caught my attention the most, there were 2 people with professional cameras. My first instinct was panic. Had I done something wrong? Did my grandfather have some legal problem I didn't know about? I slowly approached the door, with my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. The man in the suit knocked on the door with firm but respectful knocks. When I opened it, he greeted me with a kind but serious smile. "Are you Ethan Thompson, grandson of Walter Thompson?" he asked in a professional voice. "Yes, that's me," I replied with a trembling voice. "What do you need? Is something wrong?" "My name is Attorney Rodriguez. I represent the law firm Harrison & Associates," he said while extending an elegant business card. "And this is Attorney Patricia Davis, a public notary. We need to talk to you about your grandfather's will." Will? My grandfather had never mentioned anything about a will to me. Honestly, I thought he had nothing to leave behind other than his modest house, his tools, and maybe some small savings he had put aside for his medical expenses. "May we come in?" asked the notary with a kind voice. "It's important that we talk privately." I let them in, though I still didn't understand what was happening. And why were there people with cameras waiting outside? None of this made sense. We sat in my grandfather's small living room, and the attorney opened a leather briefcase from which he took out several documents. "Mr. Thompson," he began, "did your grandfather ever mention his philanthropic activities to you?" "Philanthropic?" I asked, confused. My grandfather was a carpenter. He always helped people, but he didn't have money to do philanthropy. The attorney and notary exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "Mr. Thompson," the attorney continued, "your grandfather Walter Thompson was much more than he appeared to be. For the past 30 years, he had been anonymously donating significant amounts of money to orphanages, hospitals, schools, and needy families throughout the region." I stared at him as if he had spoken to me in another language. "That's impossible," I said. "My grandfather lived very humbly. He sold his tools to pay for my college. He didn't have money to make large donations." "That's precisely the point," the notary intervened. "Your grandfather had considerable means, but chose to live simply so he could help others. Records show that over the past 3 decades, he donated more than $2 million to various charitable causes." I felt as if the ground was moving beneath my feet. $2 million? "That can't be true," I whispered. You're mistaking him for someone else. The attorney pulled out a thick folder full of documents. We have all the receipts, Mr. Thompson. Your grandfather inherited a considerable amount of money when he was young, from the sale of some land that belonged to his family. Instead of spending it on luxuries, he invested it wisely and used the profits to help others, always anonymously. No? But then, why did he live so humbly? I asked, still unable to process the information. Because that was his nature, replied the notary with a sad smile. Records show that every time his investments generated significant profits, he would donate them immediately. He kept only what was necessary to live with dignity and to take care of you. Tears began rolling down my cheeks again. But this time, they weren't just from sadness, but from a strange mixture of pride, amazement, and pain. My grandfather, the man the family had despised for being the poor carpenter, had been silently helping hundreds of people for decades. And why are you telling me this now? I asked. And what do the cameras outside have to do with this? The attorney cleared his throat. Because according to his will, you will inherit not only this property, but also a charitable foundation that your grandfather secretly established 15 years ago. A foundation with a current patrimony of $3 million, intended to continue his philanthropic work. The world seemed to stop completely. $3 million. A foundation. My grandfather, the humble carpenter, had been a millionaire and had kept it secret his entire life. Wait, I said, standing up from the chair, feeling like I was in a surreal movie. This can't be happening. My grandfather was a humble carpenter. I knew him better than anyone. We lived together for 10 years. How is it possible he was a millionaire without me realizing it? The notary smiled with understanding. Your grandfather was extraordinarily careful, Mr. Thompson. He handled all his financial affairs through our firm, always with the specific instruction to maintain absolute confidentiality. Even we didn't know about your existence until 3 years ago, when he decided to formalize his will. The attorney pulled more documents from his briefcase. Look, here we have the account statements for the Silent Hope Foundation. That's the name your grandfather gave it. For the past 15 years, it has financed the construction of 3 rural schools, paid medical treatments for more than 200 low-income families, and granted college scholarships to over 100 young people. I took the papers with trembling hands. There were the names, dates, amounts, everything meticulously documented. Silent Hope Foundation, I read aloud. Even the name was perfect for my grandfather. Hope for others. Silence for himself. But why now? I asked, still trying to process all the information. Why are all these secrets coming to light just now? That's when the notary explained something that would change everything forever. Because your grandfather left specific instructions in his will. He wanted all his philanthropic work to be revealed publicly after his death, not for him, but to inspire others. And he also wanted you, as his heir and new director of the foundation, to be publicly recognized for the work you will now have to continue. Director of the foundation? I repeated like an echo. But I don't know anything about running a foundation. I work in an accounting office. I live in a small studio apartment. I barely have any savings. Your grandfather knew exactly who you were, the attorney intervened with a warm smile. In his will he wrote, Ethan has the noblest heart I know, just like his grandmother. Just like his parents. He will know how to continue this work better than I ever could, because he has education, youth, and above all, because he learned from me that true wealth lies in giving, not in receiving. Those words hit me like lightning. It was exactly the kind of thing my grandfather would say. I could hear his voice saying it, with that mixture of tenderness and wisdom that always characterized him. And the cameras? I asked, pointing toward the window where I could see the journalists waiting. That's the most interesting part, said the notary. 3 of the journalists outside were beneficiaries of your grandfather's scholarships when they were young. When they found out who the anonymous donor really was, who had changed their lives, they decided to come do a story about him. Besides, added the attorney, we've been contacting all morning the people and families who were helped by your grandfather over the years. Many of them are on their way to pay tribute to the man who changed their lives without them even knowing his name. I sat down again, feeling like my brain couldn't process any more information. "I don't understand," I murmured. "If he had so much money, why did he sell his tools to pay for my college? Why did he let me worry about him all these years?" The notary pulled out a sealed letter from the folder. "He asked us to give you this when you asked that exact question." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. My grandfather's handwriting, that careful penmanship I knew so well, filled 2 full pages. "My dear Ethan, if you're reading this letter, it means you already know the truth about the money. I know you'll be wondering why I didn't tell you anything, why I continued living as if I were poor when I had the means to live better. The answer is simple, son, because I wanted you to grow up knowing the real value of things. I wanted you to learn to work, to strive, to value every dollar you earned with your own sweat. If I had raised you knowing we had money, you would have grown up differently, and you wouldn't have developed that noble heart you have. I sold my tools to pay for your college because I wanted it to be your achievement, your effort. I wanted you to feel the pride of having earned your education through your own merit, not through inherited money. Now you're a grown man, with solid values and a generous heart. Now you're ready to handle this responsibility. The foundation isn't just money, Ethan. It's the opportunity to keep changing lives, to keep being the silent hope for those who need it most. You don't have to be like me, son. You don't have to live in poverty to help others. Use the money wisely, live well, but never forget that true wealth lies in the lives you touch, not in the bank accounts you have. I love you more than words can express, and I trust you completely. Your grandfather who adores you, Walter." I finished reading the letter with tears falling on the paper. Everything made sense now. My grandfather hadn't just raised me. He had carefully shaped me for this moment. Outside, the noise of more cars arriving made me look out the window. What I saw took my breath away. There were at least 20 people waiting, some with flowers, others with handmade signs that said, "Thank you, Mr. Walter." Attorney Rodriguez looked at me with understanding as I finished drying the tears that had fallen on my grandfather's letter. "Mr. Thompson," he told me gently, "I think it's time for you to go out and meet all the people your grandfather helped over the years. They've come from very far away to pay tribute to the man who changed their lives." I looked out the window again, and what I saw completely took my breath away. There were no longer just 20 people. There were at least 50, and more kept arriving. There were entire families, college students, elderly people, small children. Everyone carried flowers, photographs, handmade posters. Some were crying, others were smiling, but all had the same expression of deep respect and gratitude. "I can't go out like this," I said, running my hands over my face. "I'm a mess. I don't know what to tell them. I don't know how to handle all this." The notary approached and put a maternal hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather knew this moment would come, and he knew exactly how you would react. That's why he asked us to tell you something very specific. Tell Ethan he doesn't have to be perfect. He just has to be himself. That's the person I'm proud of." I took a deep breath, smoothed my wrinkled shirt, and walked toward the door. When I opened it, the murmur of conversation stopped and all eyes turned to me. For a moment, the silence was total. Then, a middle-aged woman approached with tears in her eyes. "Are you Ethan?" she asked with a broken voice. "Mr. Walter's grandson." I nodded, not knowing what else to do. The woman hugged me as if I were her own son. "Oh, son," she told me, sobbing, "your grandfather saved my family. When my husband had the accident 10 years ago and needed urgent surgery, we had no money. We were desperate. One day, the hospital director told us that an anonymous donor had paid for the entire surgery. We never knew who it was until today." Before I could respond, a young man who couldn't be more than 25 years old approached. "Mr. Ethan," he said respectfully, "my name is Carlos Martinez. I'm the CNN journalist covering this story. But before being a journalist, I'm one of the people your grandfather helped. He paid for my entire college career through an anonymous scholarship. Thanks to him, I was able to study communications, and now I have my dream job." More people began to approach, each with their story. An elderly lady told me that my grandfather had paid for her diabetes medications for 5 years. A young couple explained that he had financed the construction of the school where their children now studied. A college student told me through tears that my grandfather's scholarship had allowed her to become the first doctor in her family. "Mr. Ethan?" said another voice, and when I turned I saw an elegant man about 40 years old. "I'm the director of Austin General Hospital. Your grandfather financed the entire pediatric wing we inaugurated last year. We've been able to save the lives of hundreds of children thanks to him. We never wanted his donation to be anonymous, but he insisted. He said what mattered wasn't that people knew who was giving, but that the children received the help they needed." Each story hit me like a wave of emotion. My grandfather, the man I thought I knew completely, had been a silent hero to hundreds of people, and I, his grandson, had been the only person at his funeral. A journalist approached with his camera. "Mr. Thompson, could we ask you some questions? People need to know this story. Your grandfather deserves to be remembered as the hero he was." I looked at all the people surrounding me, their faces full of gratitude and love toward a man who was no longer physically with us, but who had left an indelible mark on their lives. "Yes," I said finally. "I think my grandfather deserves for the whole world to know who he really was." The journalist turned on his camera and began recording. "Mr. Thompson, how do you feel discovering that your grandfather was one of the most generous philanthropists in the region?" "I feel," I began, and had to pause to control my voice. "I feel proud, confused, sad, and grateful all at the same time. Proud to be his grandson. Confused because he never told me anything. Sad because he left without me being able to properly thank him for everything he did. And grateful because he taught me to be a good person without me realizing it." "Did you know anything about your grandfather's philanthropic activities?" "Nothing," I replied honestly. To me, he was simply the best grandfather in the world. A humble carpenter who raised me with love after I lost my parents. I never suspected he had money, much less that he was helping so many people. A woman from the crowd shouted, "Your grandfather was a saint, a true angel on earth." Other voices joined in. "Mr. Walter was the best man in the world. Thanks to him, my son was able to study medicine. We'll never forget his generosity." The journalist continued, "What plans do you have with the foundation you inherited?" That question made me reflect deeply. I looked at all the people surrounding me, thought about my grandfather, his teachings, the letter I had just read. "I'm going to continue exactly what he started," I said with determination. "I'm going to make sure the Silent Hope Foundation keeps changing lives. My grandfather taught me that true wealth isn't in what you have, but in what you give. And although he's no longer physically with me, I'm going to honor his memory by helping others just as he did." At that moment, a little girl ran up and handed me a drawing. It was the figure of a man with tools in his hands and a giant smile, surrounded by hearts. "It's your grandpa," she told me with a sweet voice. "My mom says he's a hero." I took the drawing with trembling hands and knelt down to be at her level. "You know what?" I told her. "You're right. My grandfather was the greatest hero I've ever known." The crowd began to applaud, and I felt something I hadn't felt in days. A deep sense of peace and purpose. My grandfather was gone, but his legacy would live forever, and I had the most beautiful responsibility in the world, to continue his work. The hours that followed were the most extraordinary of my life. What had started as the loneliest funeral in the world had become a spontaneous celebration of my grandfather's life. The small street where his house was located filled completely with people who kept arriving from different parts of the state, each with a story to tell about how Mr. Walter had touched their lives. I decided to open the doors of the house so everyone could come in and share their memories. The small living room filled with voices, laughter, and tears of joy. It was exactly the opposite of the painful silence of the day before, and for the first time since his death, I felt that my grandfather was really being said goodbye to as he deserved. An elderly woman, leaning on a cane, approached me with a shoebox in her hands. "Son," she told me with a trembling voice, "I want you to see this." She opened the box, and inside were dozens of old photographs. "Your grandfather came to my neighborhood every Christmas for 15 years. He gave toys to all the children, but always asked that we not take pictures of him. I took them secretly because I knew that someday someone would need to know who that angel was who brightened our holidays. I looked through the photographs with amazement. There was my grandfather, year after year, carrying bags full of gifts, surrounded by smiling children. In some photos, he looked younger. In others, he already had the gray hair I remembered. But in all of them, he had the same expression, that genuine smile of someone who finds true happiness in the happiness of others. "Can I keep one?" I asked with a choked voice. The elderly woman took my hand and put the entire box in my arms. "They're yours, son. Your grandfather gave me so many years of joy that it's the least I can do." Another man approached with a manila envelope. "Mr. Ethan, I'm a contractor. Your grandfather hired me 8 years ago to build a house for a family that had lost everything in a fire. He paid me double the normal amount, but with one condition, that I never tell the family who had paid for the construction. For years that family thought it had been a government program. Here I have all the construction photos and the original plans that your grandfather drew himself." Each person who approached added one more piece to the puzzle of who my grandfather had really been. A teacher told me that he had paid the salaries of 3 teachers for 2 years when the rural school had no budget. A nurse explained that he had financed a free vaccination program that saved the lives of hundreds of children. A veterinarian told me that my grandfather had paid for the free sterilization of strayed dogs to control overpopulation. Your grandfather, the veterinarian told me with admiration, cared about every living being. He said that if God gave us the ability to help, it was our duty to do it without expecting recognition. As the day progressed, more media outlets arrived at the scene. Television, radio, and newspaper journalists wanted to cover the story of the Silent Saint of Texas, as they were already calling him. But the most beautiful thing was that none of the people who had come to pay tribute had done so because of the cameras. They had come out of genuine love for a man who had changed their lives. The attorney approached me during the afternoon. "Mr. Ethan, there's something else you need to know. We've been receiving calls all morning. It turns out your grandfather's story has spread on social media faster than we expected. We have interview requests from national programs, and there are already people from other states asking if the foundation can help them too." I felt overwhelmed for a moment. How am I going to handle all this? Yesterday I was an ordinary accountant worried about paying my bills. And now it turns out I'm responsible for $1 million foundation that the whole country is getting to know. The notary, who had stayed close all day, smiled at me. "Remember what your grandfather said in the letter? That you don't have to be perfect, just be yourself. We're going to help you with all the legal and administrative aspects. You just have to make the decisions about who to help and how to do it." At that moment, one of the journalists who had been recording testimonials approached. "Mr. Thompson, I have to ask you something personal. How do you feel knowing that your family didn't attend the funeral of such an extraordinary man?" The question hurt, but no longer with the same intensity as the day before. "My family," I replied carefully, "missed the opportunity to really know my grandfather. They judged him by appearances, by his simple house and his carpenter's job. They never took the time to know his heart. It's their loss, not his." Would you hold a grudge against them for not being there when he needed them? I thought about my grandfather, about everything he had taught me about forgiveness and compassion. My grandfather wouldn't have wanted me to hold a grudge against anyone. He taught me that hatred only hurts the one who feels it. If my uncles and cousins showed up tomorrow asking for forgiveness, they would be welcome. But if they showed up just for the money, as I suspect will happen, I'll make it very clear to them that the foundation exists to help those who really need it, not to enrich family members who never cared about him. When night came, the crowd began to disperse, but not before creating something that moved me to tears. Spontaneously, they had created an impromptu altar in my grandfather's small garden. They had placed flowers, candles, photographs, thank you letters, children's drawings, and in the center, someone had placed one of his favorite tools, a carpenter's hammer, with the handle worn by years of use. "Mr. Walter?" someone shouted from the crowd. "Thank you for everything." And like a chorus, dozens of voices joined in. "Thank you, Mr. Walter. Rest in peace. We'll never forget you." I stayed alone in the garden when everyone left, looking at that altar of love they had created for my grandfather. I took out my phone and called my Uncle Robert, the oldest of my father's brothers. "Ethan," he answered, surprised. "How are you, son? We heard that your grandfather—" "Uncle," I interrupted him with a serene voice, "I wanted you to know that my grandfather's funeral was beautiful. More than 200 people came to say goodbye to him. It turns out he was a very beloved and respected person, a person who helped change many lives." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Ethan, we thought that maybe. If you're going to come now for the money, Uncle, don't bother. But if you want to come to really know who my grandfather was and honor his memory, you'll be welcome." I hung up the phone and sat in my grandfather's rocking chair. For the first time in days, I felt complete. My grandfather was gone, but his legacy would live forever. And I had the most beautiful mission in the world, to make sure his kindness continued touching lives for many years to come. "Thank you, Grandpa," I whispered to the night air. "Thank you for teaching me that true wealth is measured in lives changed, not in bank accounts. I promise I'll make you proud." A gentle breeze moved the leaves of the tree he had planted years ago, and for a moment I swear I could feel his presence, his approval, his eternal love. The story of the silent saint of Texas was just beginning.